This is a 1999 Nissan S15 Silvia Spec-R, and it's incredibly cool. A lightweight rear-wheel drive car with good power that was never sold here in North America. Now, this car has become famous for its tuning capabilities and its drifting prowess, but we've never been able to get it here until now. This one is legal, old enough to import, and it has a US title. And today I'm going to review the S15 Silvia and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this S15 Silvia is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This car has a 6-speed manual transmission. It is incredibly unmodified and it's here with a US title. All of that stuff makes this car tremendously special and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this S15 Silvia, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the S15 Silvia. First, a little explanation of this car for people who don't know what it is. Now, back in the 90s, Nissan had several different levels of sports car in its lineup, which is hard to imagine now, but back then you could sell a bunch of different sports cars and still make money. The Silvia was sort of the entry-level sports car, rear-wheel drive, sporty, but not as high performance as the Skyline GTR and the 300ZX that occupied kind of the higher level of Nissan's performance car hierarchy. Now, this car was never sold here in the US, in North America. We did get earlier versions of this car as the Nissan 240SX, which was a legendary car in its own right, renowned for its drifting potential because it's rear-wheel drive and its lightweight tunability. A lot of benefits of that car, but Nissan never gave us the big, powerful engines that they offered in Japan. The max power we got on a 240SX in the US was 155 horses, not exactly huge even for the 90s. And this version was never sold here. We got the 240SX up to 98. This was the next generation model, but it was never brought to North America. So this car has always been kind of forbidden fruit, a special car we couldn't have. And that's especially true of this particular S15 Silvia because it's basically the best version you could get. For one thing, it has the best powertrain. This is the SR20 DET, which was Nissan's internal code, now known by all enthusiasts, for a 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder that made just under 250 horsepower. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge number, but it was the late 90s. This car doesn't weigh very much, and it was a big boost over what we were getting in the US in our 155 horsepower 240SX. This lurked in Japan, never available to us with all this extra power and tuning potential. And this particular S15 Silvia is even more special because it's the Spec-R model, which was one of the high performance trims that were offered. In addition to including the big powertrain, it also had some other boosts, including upgraded suspension, sportier with anti-roll bars and strut bracing, as you can see here in the trunk. This is not an aftermarket edition. This was included on the Spec-R models to improve handling. The Spec-R also got a limited slip differential, which of course added performance capability and improved brakes from the 300ZX, Nissan's impressive kind of top-of-the-line sports car. And there were cosmetic changes as well. The Spec-R got, well, a cool body kit with these flared rocker panels, as you can see, and also, most importantly, this big wing in the back to really distinguish itself from a standard S15 Silvia. You also got Spec-R badging, as you can see right here in front of the rear wheels on both sides, Spec-R, that made this car more special. All of that added together, and this is a pretty desirable version of a very desirable car. And since we're talking exterior stuff, let's move on to some interesting quirks and features. And let's go back to badging for a second. You can see in the front this S badge, very distinctive, cool looking. That was in place of a Nissan badge on the front. And of course, S stood for Silvia. Back in the day, Nissan had basically emblems for each one of its vehicles. They would go on the hood instead of a general Nissan badge, which is kind of interesting, especially by modern standards. Another cool exterior quirk in this car, the third brake light, which is not only integrated into the big Spec-R spoiler, but you can see it's triangular, which is obviously an interesting shape, and it looks cool when it comes on, as you can see, kind of a neat little quirk of this car. You also had a rear wiper, which is unusual, particularly by North American standards, where rear wipers are almost only ever found on cars with a hatchback or a tailgate. In Japan in the 90s, it wasn't uncommon to have rear wipers on cars with trunks, sedans and coupes just like this, and that's the case here, but it's certainly unusual from a North American perspective. Now, aside from those quirks and the Spec-R detailing, you can see this isn't a particularly exciting looking car. It doesn't stand out. It's not especially flashy, and that was part of the point. To create the high performance versions of this car, Nissan took a fairly standard commuter car, the regular Silvia, and kind of hotted it up with the big engine and the other upgrades that I mentioned. So just like the Nissan Skyline started its life as a fairly normal car and then got made muscular, that's exactly what happened here. And so the exterior styling doesn't look quite as sporty as you might expect, or as the 300ZX, which was obviously a purpose-built sports car from the beginning. And that becomes especially clear when you climb inside this car, and you can see the interior is fairly basic, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. It's not exciting or splashy or thrilling like you might associate with a sports car that they want to keep you happy and having fun inside. Instead, the Silvia borrows its interior from, well, the Silvia, a base level kind of entry model, and it's not particularly gimmicky or full of crazy features. With that said, there are a few interesting quirks in this interior. We start, for example, on the steering wheel, where you see that S logo has repeated itself here. Once again, no regular Nissan logo, but instead the S for Silvia. Same deal on the gear lever. You can see on the top, the S logo has taken its place. Oddly, instead of a gear pattern, which they then print down below. The pattern was a secondary thought to getting that S onto the gear lever. You also see the Silvia script over on the passenger side, which looks pretty cool and was a kind of distinctive way they wrote it out. And that script also appears on the door sill. As you can see, it says Silvia there too. And on the floor mats, Silvia once again. Plus, you have this very late 90s floor mat design with these sort of random stripes in between the floor mat. Didn't really make any sense, but it made sense in the 90s. Now, speaking of the floors and the floor mats, over on the passenger side of this car, the floor has a hump, as you can see. This was an odd feature that found its way into some cars in this era. There was some mechanical component they just couldn't relocate anywhere else, so they put a hump on the passenger side. It doesn't really affect you because your legs stick out much further than that, but it is funny to see that sort of failure of packaging. I'm sure they tried to get rid of it, but they just couldn't. Also, another interesting quirk in this car is the boost gauge. You can see here mounted on the A-pillar and facing the driver. This is a place where racers usually put aftermarket gauges to show all sorts of stuff or just to look cool. But here, Nissan from the factory actually put a boost gauge here, which kind of tells you what this car's aim was, sort of the tuner crowd with this cool factory gauge. Now, as for the seats, you can see they're fairly well bolstered seats designed to keep you in place, and the centers are mesh. Now, this car came in the days before Alcantara became very common, but the mesh seat center served roughly the same purpose. It provided additional friction so that you wouldn't slide around in a racetrack setting, since a lot of these cars were used in high-performance driving, and that's your sports seat. Now, beyond all that stuff, again, very simple, very basic in this interior, and very basic controls. You can see the climate controls, only a few buttons and a dial, not too much to that climate controls, although I've always loved how the fan control works in these 90s Nissans. To turn up the fan, you press the fan button and then it just colors in more of the fan graphic as it goes, which I kind of like. Now, below that, you have a couple of other simple controls, the defroster, the hazards, and the cigarette lighter power switch. It's all fairly simple. Same deal with your turn signal and wiper stalks, although it's worth pointing out they are reversed. Because this is a right-hand drive car, the turn signal stalk is over on the right side. So North American drivers are going to accidentally put on the wipers sometimes when going for the turn signals. It will happen. Interestingly, not all right-hand drive cars have the stalks reversed. I've been in many right-hand drive cars where the turn signal stalk is on the left side. So it's not uniform on right-hand drive cars, but on this car, it is over on the right. Again, basic control is very simple, with the exception of this bizarre aftermarket stereo, this double din head unit, which is just so deep early 2000s Japan. Every car that comes out of Japan that's been imported to the US, no matter how unmodified, the stereo has been modified. And that is the case here too. In fact, this thing is so ridiculous that even when you turn it off, this giant graphic comes across the screen that says off, and then it continues to display animated graphics, even though the whole thing is not on anymore. And when you select a CD, same deal. It shows a giant image of a huge CD and then continues to show various animations. Certainly an interesting addition to this interior, but very period correct. Now, as for the back seats in the S15 Silvia, you can see it is quite tight back there. Even in the Skyline, which was a bigger car, it had tight back seats. This car, they're even smaller, but they're there if you want the practicality. And you can see they're these sort of low-set bucket seats. They will really keep you in place on the racetrack, which is actually kind of a cool look. And you can see no middle seat back here, just two individual buckets, basically, that you sit really low inside. I also love the storage panel on the side of the rear seats. You can see it's actually surprisingly large. It basically goes all the way to the exterior bodywork of the car. It's almost like they didn't want to make a trim panel here to cover this up, so they said, just leave it open. You can use it as storage. It'll be our one comfort concession to the rear seat passengers who are otherwise pretty smushed back in there. And next up, we move on to the trunk in the S15 Silvia, which, as you can see, is a fairly straightforward affair. Carpeted, fairly large actually for a car like this, but fairly standard with not too much exceptional or unusual, aside from that strut brace, which I mentioned before, and just sort of takes up a little bit of space back here. Otherwise, fairly standard trunk situation in this car. Now, as for S15 Silvia history, like I said, this car was highly respected, forbidden fruit, very cool, but when it went away after the 2002 model year, Nissan didn't replace it. The entry-level coupe segment was kind of dying off, and it's certainly a lot more dead today. Again, it's hard to imagine a time when automakers could have had multiple different performance cars in their lineup. Now, Nissan struggles to sell the Z and the GTR, and probably both of them won't last. So this car was never really followed up on, and now it's been 25 years since it first came out, which means it is now legally importable to the United States. And so this one has been legally imported, and I am very excited to get behind the wheel and be one of the first people to drive a legal S15 Silvia here in North America. Let's do it. All right, driving the S15 Silvia. This thing is cool. This was delivered to our office about a week ago, and I've been eyeing it for the last week, just excited for my chance to get behind the wheel of this car. A little bit of my history, I own an R32 Skyline GTR. Love those cars, R32, 33, 34, I love them all. I'm a big fan of the 240SX that was sold here in the US, which is essentially the S14. I think that that's a really cool car. I just, like a lot of people, wish that it had gotten more power. The one that was sold here, 155 horses out of an NA4 cylinder. People mod them and they get more power, but it would have been cool to get that from the factory. And so I've always viewed this car, this version specifically, as kind of exactly that. Like, it's that little size car, but with the power that I always wished that the US market 240SX had gotten. And so it's kind of neat to be able to drive this thing and see what it's like. These cars have a very analog feel. It's buzzy, you feel the powertrain, you feel the buzzy through the shifter. The ride is relatively bumpy. Like, and the steering feels quite connected. When you turn the wheel, it quickly moves without, over power assisting and without feeling electric. It really does feel like a connected, relatively small, relatively analog car, which is obviously because it is. That was always one of the benefits of all the Skylines, and this car feels fairly similarly, which is nice. Now, to me, the coolest thing about this particular car is that it's largely unmodified, which is just getting so hard to find. Obviously it's cool in the sense that it's an S15 Silvia, and that is a special car. I mean, when the 240SX went away, we all learned about the S15 almost immediately in video games, and we wished it was here, we wished it was here, and we've been wishing it was here for 25 years, and now it's finally here. And it's still pretty desirable, to be totally honest. Like, it's still a neat car. I'm still excited to see it in the US. So let's ring it out and see what it does. Woo! It is quick, and it is little. I loved my R32 because it was so little and so tossable, and this feels like that. And honestly, even though this is only a 4-cylinder, it feels punchy and fast. Woo! This is a fantastic powertrain. You get good power, even all the way through the rev range. It's still going. It's still delivering it to me. Oh, this is great. This is great. What an impressive car. Man, if only this had come to the States and had this powertrain, what a cool thing this would have been. What a cool special car this could have been. It still is, but with a long wait and with right-hand drive. Not exactly the ideal situation. It would have been neat to have it back then. Wow, it's a great powertrain. It's very responsive, it's buzzy and it's loud, but I think in this car it gets away with it because this is a performance car and that's kind of what people are interested in. A little bit of on-center vagueness, but the body just moves so fast. The whole car just moves so fast when you start to change direction with the wheel. It's just a fairly light car, and boy is that clear from the moment you get going. Oh, I love this powertrain. It feels, it is a 4-cylinder, but man, does it feel quick. Woo! Just got a ton of great torque that is just always ready, always on demand, always capable and available for getting going quickly. Man, this is a fun car. This powertrain really delivers an excellent amount of horsepower and a really potent feel to it. It does not feel like a little 4-cylinder. This thing feels like it has a lot of juice to go, especially in the mid-range, which is where 4-cylinders often lack the most. This thing is ready. I mean, it's turbocharged, it's got big power, but it seems to be designed absolutely perfectly for a turbo 4-cylinder, which is something I often find myself saying about modern cars, since turbocharging has come so far and it's so common now. But this one is great even for its day, even by modern standards. And the clutch is very easy. The gear selector is excellent to move into gear. It feels absolutely perfect to slot in there. Not too heavy, not too light, just perfect. What a neat car, and what a great way to experience it in a pretty low mileage, unmodified, best kind of version of it. Really nice to have some time in an S15 after all these years of wanting to. And so that's the S15 Nissan Silvia Spec-R, and a very special one, unmodified with a US title, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Silvia a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 52 out of 100, which puts it here against some similar cars. The Silvia Spec-R is really neat, with more power and faster acceleration and sharper handling than I was expecting, and it has the cool factor of being a forbidden car that we couldn't get, which adds to the appeal. Drawbacks are a fairly dull interior and the annoyance of right-hand drive, but those are relatively small gripes compared to the thrill of this car, which really did surprise me, as I wasn't expecting it to be quite as enjoyable as it is.